opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not represent or reflect the official policy or position of the Take a Paycheck Foundation and podcast. All information shared is from personal experiences and does not constitute medical advice. We do not take responsibility for any statements expressed during the podcast. Take a Paycheck does not endorse any products or services. Any said products or services mentioned on this podcast may not be suitable for you or your condition. Please consult with your physician if you have medical questions, as it may pertain to your condition.
Hi everyone, welcome back to this week's episode on Take a Paycheck. I'm so excited to have Cole joining me today. Hi Cole, can you give me a brief introduction about yourself? Tell me a little bit about your education, your career, and what you've been up to recently.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Natasha. So for those who don't know, my name is Cole Mary. I'm a professional engineer. So my background, I have a bachelor's in mechanical engineering and a master's in mechatronics engineering. I'm a professional engineer, and then I decided to go back to school, and I'm in the rehabilitation sciences program, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at UBC. So I've just been kind of floating around in the engineering space, and then decided to pursue more of the healthcare angle of that, and kind of how the intersection between healthcare and technology is really where I kind of sit in that. And yeah, just been looking to how can we use all this novel technology and all this cool stuff that's being done around us to enhance healthcare and rehabilitation.
Yeah, that sounds so interesting. So you're on this podcast because you're diagnosed with a rheumatic disease. What is your diagnosis and when were you diagnosed?
Yeah, so I was actually diagnosed with osteoarthritis about 3 years ago, so around 2020, 2019. Symptoms kind of came on in 2017, so I've been dealing with it for kind of 5-6 years now. Went on to have a hip replacement in September of 2022. So I've just been kind of coming off of the rehab from that. But yeah, essentially getting a little bit into the history of all of this. I didn't really have any sort of trauma or any really sort of traumatic event or coming on of my disease. It was kind of one day I was at the gym, I was doing a squat and it kind of felt a little weird. And this was again in 2017. Came out of that, just something didn't feel right. So it kind of cascaded and I sat on it for a few months, dealt with that, did the physiotherapy, the physiatry, had some imaging done, and then was diagnosed following that. So been kind of, and we can get into the details if you want, but been kind of bouncing around in the system until I had a previous surgery in 2021. That didn't really take, so decided to go and get the joint replacement in September of 2022.
What were the symptoms that you had that kind of led you to go see a healthcare professional?
Yeah, so reflecting on that, I think it's hard to not know. And I think that's the main thing, being kind of a younger guy, pretty active. I wasn't sure if it was just like a pain and strain. I think we've all been in the gym and like you're doing your exercises and something doesn't feel right, but you sit on it for a couple of days and then it resolves itself. So I think that was the biggest point of ambiguity for me personally. I was going through this. I wasn't sure if I was just kind of being a wuss, for lack of a better term, and like it's just a little bit of pain. Maybe I just pulled something, just a muscle strain or something like that. But it just kind of, it wouldn't get better. And I think that was the main thing that I'm getting at here is a lot of these kind of minor aches and pains resolve after a couple of weeks. But I just had this nagging hip pain. And that was the first symptom that kind of came on, was that initial session, something didn't feel right. And then I just kind of had this nagging pain that wasn't resolving. And I was trying to stretch it out. I was foam rolling. I was doing all these kind of active rehab stuff and all self-management at this point, but just trying to kind of throw the kitchen sink at it to get this nagging hip better. And then it just wasn't getting better. So what those symptoms are specifically, it was just kind of like nagging pain directly on the joint, pain while I was walking, no real like clicking or anything like that, but it was just something didn't feel right. And I think we can all kind of resonate with that of when you're used to a norm, and especially when you have something like the other side, which was healthy at this point, you know what things should feel like, and something just didn't.
So what healthcare professional did you see? Was it like a family physician, a rheumatologist, an allied healthcare professional? Because I know that you kind of mentioned that, you had this pain, but it kind of felt like you wanted to make it go away before you made that decision to go see a doctor. And I think that was also for me too. Like I had swollen fingers, and so we used to like wrap it around and hope for it to go away before we saw a doctor. So I'm wondering, like, what healthcare professional did you end up seeing?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think I definitely sat on it for probably longer than I should have, but ended up, I think, again, we're taking me back a few years, but I think I probably saw GP first. So just went in like, hey, having this nagging hip pain, not really sure what it's related to. It's been sitting around for months at a time. And then I think he probably referred me to go see a physio. So physio was the first one that I saw, and I went and saw one of them for probably 6 to 12 months specifically. So just working on kind of anything and everything under the sun. I honestly thought it was just musculoskeletal. So that was my main kind of point of inquiry going to talk to them, was how can I stretch this out in a different way, or what aspect of kind of muscular strengthening can I do to try and reinforce this joint and really fix this hip pain. So at that point, I didn't think it was the joint specifically. I thought it was just kind of connective tissue or muscles itself. So yeah, that was kind of the first point of contact from there, and then kind of bounced around again from that physio. Nothing was kind of working. So then went and got referred to the physiatrist. So I went physio, back to GP. Physio is not working. I've kind of thrown the book at it. And then he referred me to the physiatrist to go have a bunch more rehab done with him.
And then when did you end up getting like the diagnosis of osteoarthritis?
Yeah, so kind of following that train of thought, it was physio for about 6 to 12 months, saw the GP, went on the wait list to go see the physiatrist. So physiatrist being the kind of sports and rehab actual medical doctor. So it's the physical exercise doctor essentially. So that's the physiatrist. Went and saw him for about 6 to 12 months. And throughout that process, that's when the diagnosis actually came on. So we were doing a bunch of stuff related to joint injections and whatnot. And then I went and had some imaging done. So had an x-ray, and then I think the actual diagnosis came on when I had an MRI of my hip. So again, got on a wait list for that, went and got the MRI. And that was at the point when I went back to the physiatrist that he kind of informed me that I had OA of my hip.
So how long was this like process? It just sounds like you had a lot of back and forth communication.
And that's one thing that I think your whole audience and you specifically can probably attest to, of like, it's a process. And I think that's a lot of things that one of the advantages of Canadian healthcare is it's so accessible, and you do have opportunities to access all this different care, and it's great care, but there is such this kind of lag between these different sessions. So it was like I said, I started this process in about 2017, and it was probably end of 2019, early 2020 when I got that actual diagnosis. So it was like definitely partially my fault of trying to nurse it at home by myself. And I think a lot of people do the same, but did that for months and then tried everything with the physio and then went. So it just kind of cascaded into this long process that took a few years to get that diagnosis, but kind of one of those things. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that kind of experience.
Yeah, but it's interesting for me, like I also did kind of like, okay, I think a lot of my family and I, we were kind of in denial that it should, because I played tennis, so it just made sense.
Yeah.
Okay, why is your wrist hurting? Why is your finger hurting? Probably because you play tennis. And so like we always related it to tennis, and that kind of led me to wait a couple weeks and tie it up, and I don't know, it was just like a
Yeah.
lot of random stuff that we were doing to like make sure that it was not anything more than what it was. And like when I didn't see anything get better, then I went to my GP, and luckily I was diagnosed in like less than a month, which is very rare
Oh,
for
wow.
all the people that I've talked to in my podcast and people that I've just talked to in general. I don't know, he just like did a blood test and it said that my rheumatoid factor was positive and high. And so he's like, hey, you have arthritis, let's refer you to Sick Kids. Like it was so quick, which is not normal for a lot of people.
Yeah. So what was the process leading up to that point of going to get that blood test? Like how long did you do all that your own rehab and like taping things and whatnot? How long before that did it take?
Well, I was feeling symptoms in September of 2016, and then it kind of progressed to my fingers, my wrists, my feet, and then September to October, we wrapped it up. Maybe like 2 or 3 weeks. It wasn't multiple months. It was like 2 to 3 weeks, and then we're like, this is not getting better. So then I
Yeah.
went to my GP in October, and then mid-October I was referred to Sick Kids. And I think it also depends on like who can actually find what is wrong with you, or you have to be able to like order the correct tests and things like that, right? Like you have to get that MRI, you have to get the blood test. Not everyone can tell that this is what's gonna happen, you know? Even as doctors, can't really predict that this is what it's gonna be.
Totally. And I think that resonates with me because I think I went through the same process a little bit with the physiatrist. So originally, like the idea was your hip's hurting, you've tried all the active rehab, like that's great. If it is osteoarthritis, logic would dictate that a joint injection, so specifically like a steroid shot in the actual joint, you should see some resolution of that if it's the actual hip joint itself. So going to the physiatrist after doing a few sessions with him, he's like, let's try a joint shot. went in, did one of those, and I had no difference in pain. So like totally atypical to what I thought should happen. Like at this point, I'm more or less convinced it's my hip. Let's do the injection. Everything's going to be better, and then I know it's my hip definitively. But that didn't happen, and I think that that was one of the things of like you said, ordering the right tests and like, okay, now we're kind of on ground zero. How does this shape out? So I actually went and had my back. I had an MRI on my back, and then did a nerve root block on my back because they thought that could be referring the pain in my hip. So again, just kind of ping ponging around the system of try this, try that. What are we going to do to kind of prevent surgery or like a full total hip replacement? How can we try all these different factors? So like you said, it's amazing, these different aspects. You think it's just you walk in and you go from A to B to C and then you get your care. But honestly, you hit all these different marks and some things work out. And it really kind of speaks to the idea that medicine is almost as much of an art as it is a science.
Just because I was able to get that diagnosis in a month doesn't mean that after that I couldn't find medication for 2 years that worked for me. So it's like you can get that diagnosis, but now it's like, what do I do with that diagnosis? Because you need to find, what medication will work, how to reduce that inflammation that's probably been there for a couple of years prior. I don't know. I feel like a lot of the times people think like, yes, we're going to get that diagnosis, but it's just so much more than that. Because for me, it took 2 years. And you mentioned joint injections and how that didn't work for you. Did you only get those joint injections once or multiple times? How did that work?
Yeah, so I got the first one that didn't take, and then I went and had this kind of whole sidetrack of going down the back route and trying to fix that. And then in preparation, I was kind of contemplating if surgery was on the table after that because the back thing didn't really pan out and that didn't help. So when I was talking to the physiatrist again, like, hey, we explored the joint injection, that didn't take. Then we went into the back, that didn't take as well. Like, what are the steps now? Like, do I go see the ortho surgeon or do we want to try something different? And he was kind of at the point of like, not sure what to do. Let's go talk to the surgeon. But do you want to try another injection just to be rigorous? And I think that was a nice option. So I did end up having a second joint injection and that same kind of result, no pain resolution or anything related to that. And what they ended up finding in the MRI actually was the dye that was used in the MRI. It was actually bleeding into one of the bursa in the hips. So it was like, it wouldn't sit in the hip joint as far as I know. And I'm kind of in deep waters here, a little bit out of my depth in terms of anatomy. But the dye that they were putting in the joint was actually bleeding out. So I think that kind of comes back to the idea of maybe all the joint injections, so the actual steroid wasn't necessarily sticking within the joint capsule itself. It could have been kind of transitioning out, or something to that effect. Anyways, again, I'm kind of out of my depth, but basically how I interpreted it was all the stuff that was supposed to help wasn't sitting in that joint capsule. So it kind of gave me a sense of like, even though we put it there, maybe it's not staying there, which is ultimately leading to this. So I don't know. It was a weird thing, but yeah, ended up having the joint injections twice, same kind of result, nothing took. So then ended up getting referred to the surgeon after that.
Wow. So I also had joint injections. I had 10 joint injections in,
Holy moly.
yeah, when I was 16 because none of the medications worked. So I had 10 joint injections. But at that point, I
Yeah.
literally couldn't walk. I could barely write. I was like suffering. So,
Yeah.
but for me, it really helped. I was able to do a lot more. And obviously, a joint injection is just a band-aid and it doesn't work for everyone and anyone. So after
Yeah.
6 months, like it wears 6 months to a year, it wears off. And that's what my rheumatologist told me. So then I had to find medication that worked for me. And luckily, I did find that. But I still had flare-ups here and there. And so I had to get another joint injection in on my pinky and wrist.
Yeah.
Actually, in total in my life, I have joint injections like 3 times. So the first time was 10 joints, then it became 2, and then it became 1. So it like slowly went
Okay.
down. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's interesting to hear from your perspective that it didn't really work, and that just shows that like not everything works for everyone, and so like individualized and personal.
Totally. And did you get them in all different joints? Like you said previously, like pain was affecting a bunch of different joints. Was that kind of the angle they took with the joint injections, is kind of just throw everything at it, or?
So it was my ankles and then my wrists and then my fingers. And so they had to do a couple fingers because it was like literally very, very swollen to the point where it was like, it just did not look like, now it's completely different. And I'm like very grateful for
Yeah.
that. But at that point I didn't have medication that worked for me. And I had damage in my like fingers and wrists and ankles. So they were like, we need to do something. So first it was my ankles, my wrist and my fingers. And then the second time it was just one of my fingers and then my left wrist. And then the third time it was just my wrist. My wrist is like the worst and to type and write all the time.
Oh, brutal.
Yeah. So, but it worked and I was like very grateful for that. But I see like how you had to find something else and try other ways to kind of manage your pain. And so let's jump into surgery. So I'm assuming that that's something that you had to go through. So let me just bring us back to that. At 29 years old, you were given the option to have a total hip replacement. What were your thoughts at that time when you were going through this option?
Yeah, it's a weird one, and I think I wouldn't mind taking it back for a second. Just I wanted to ask you, like, you go from this healthy individual, and I think this gets into the idea of this total joint replacement, and we can explore that in a second. But like, what did it feel like for you going from you're playing tennis, you're super active, you're a young person, and then all of a sudden, like, boom, you get this pain, then you get a diagnosis all within a relatively short period of time. Like, I was just curious on what that felt like for you of being like, you get this diagnosis that you wouldn't expect at this age objectively, and happy to talk on my side of things related to that. But I was just curious on what was that like for you, and how did that affect kind of like all your biopsychosocial things related to your daily living? Like, it's a huge question. There's no right answer, obviously, but like, we're going from like you were in state A and then all of a sudden you're in state B, and like, what was that transition like?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed in grade 8 with juvenile
Yeah,
idiopathic arthritis. And in grade 8, that's like such a weird time to get this diagnosis because it's like I'm going to high school
totally.
soon, but I was also in elementary school, so people knew me in that way. And then now I'm like making new friends and going into a new kind of area. And in grade 8, I had no idea what this was and why I was dealing with it. And I couldn't even explain it to other people because I had no idea myself. And I guess like the more like social aspect of it, like I changed my lifestyle, which we'll get into for what you did, but I changed my lifestyle. So like I didn't eat certain things just to like see if it would work for me and like my inflammation levels. And then I couldn't do gym class. I couldn't lift things up. That was like when my arthritis was super active. I had to miss a week of school because I couldn't walk for some reason. I
Wow.
had no idea why. So it was just like a lot. I couldn't write anymore. Like imagine going from someone who
Dude,
could,
that's huge.
yeah, someone that could do their homework every single day. And I know this is for other people, it's like, oh my God, you didn't get to do your homework? That sounds great. But for me, I was such a high achiever. And the fact that I
Yeah.
couldn't do the assignments, the tests, the quizzes, and like do things that other people did was just so hard for me. It didn't make sense how one day I was fine and the next day I was in so much pain. So it was kind of like
Yeah.
learning how to adapt. And I think that whole transition adapting process happened in high school because in high school, you meet new people, you're in a new environment.
To reiterate, Natasha, I think that's super challenging for you, and I commend you on being able to take on such a huge thing at such a young and vulnerable age. Objectively, like, I think coming from my angle, I was a little bit older, and I'll get into that in a sec. But having that in grade 8, like, I couldn't imagine. You're at such an impressionable age. You have like all the social elements, let alone you're trying to work your way towards university or whatever occupation you want to get into. Like, so many moving parts at that age. That couldn't have been easy to take on, and I commend you for that. Versus, I think in my case, I was a little bit older. So again, I was probably thinking back 6 years, 24, 25 when this diagnosis came on. So I was out of undergrad. I think, yeah, I just finished up, or I was finishing up my master's at this point. So I was kind of on the trajectory where I knew where I was going to be in a couple of years. I had an idea of what field I was going to be working in. I was more or less stable in terms of had a good relationship going. I had a lot of my daily routine down. So I think, and I was just kind of quote unquote like fully developed as an adult, like mentally. I had all those different things in line. So for me, getting this diagnosis, it was definitely weird. And I think that was the main thing I can relate to for yours was like, and as you mentioned, it's not known as a young person's disease. Like, you think of like hip pain, okay, you have osteoarthritis. Well, I don't have to worry about that. I'm not 65 years old, right? Like, young people don't get joint replacements unless you're in a car accident or something like that, where you've had this traumatic event. Like, it doesn't just wear out. I'm 30. Like, I've ran marathons before. I'm quite active. Like, I'm doing everything right. Why are we going down this road? So I think that was the main thing for me of trying to accept this idea of going from this healthy person doing all these different active things to accepting this diagnosis, and like, oh, like, you want to run, running's not really an option anymore. And like, I'd already kind of known that, and we can get into lifestyle things before, and like how I just naturally kind of changed some of my activities to accommodate, like, running gives me a huge flare up, it's not worth the cost of that, let's exclude that. Like, heavy squats or deadlifts or things like this, they're just not worth it because it destroys me for the next couple days. So I think that element was like a weird shift, and it kind of started to shift how I was doing various things in my life. But as far as the diagnosis goes, it was just kind of a strange, like we all wear different hats in life, and I've got my engineering hat, I've got my PhD hat, I've got my other lifestyle and hobby hat and all this kind of stuff. And then you all of a sudden you go from this normal individual to now I'm taking on a chronic disease hat, or I'm going to get a joint replacement. Like it's a weird transition. And I think that was something that I kind of had. I didn't necessarily struggle with it, but it was just grappling with it of, again, this change of lifestyle. Like you're a marathon runner and now you can't do that anymore. And you can't even run like a couple kilometers. Like you can do it, but you're going to pay through the nose for it. And I think that was just a weird shift for me.
Moving from that, at 29 years old, you were given the option to have a total hip replacement. What was your thought process while going through some of these options?
Yeah, so walking it back a little bit. So I had a hip arthroscopy in July of 2021. So that's a minimally invasive surgery. I was in Kelowna at this time. Surgeon goes in and basically does a minimally invasive procedure where they try and clean out the joint. So the whole goal, and to reflect back on kind of the nature of surgery in this sense, they want to preserve as much of the native anatomy as possible. So in an ideal circumstance, obviously you're not going to change your hip joint just for the sake of it. They want to keep as much of your normal anatomy as possible. So the idea is, first, let's go in, and after talking to the surgeon a little bit, we said, like, we don't know if this is going to work or not, but it's kind of the best case scenario at this point of you've tried the joint injections, it's not your back. We think it's got to be something regarding the hip. Let's go in and we can try and clean it up as much as possible. We don't really know what we're going to find because the MRI did say some stuff, but then the injection didn't work. So it was kind of like the surgeon basically said, like, this isn't a silver bullet. We don't know if this is going to give you what you're looking for, but we're kind of at the end of the road as far as like management options go, right? Because we've done all the musculoskeletal stuff, we've done the injections, we've done the MRI, like surgery's an option. So let's go do that. So had the minimally invasive surgery. They ended up, so we went in, they told me they removed a 3 by 3 centimeter piece of cartilage from the joint. So if you think about that, like that's a pretty big size, right? Like almost alarmingly big. So coming out of surgery with that was definitely like a huge piece of cartilage that they took out. Like at that point, he's like, you definitely have osteoarthritis. We tried to fix it up as much as possible. And they did this thing called a microfracture. So what that exactly is they pulled this loose body out of the joint. So that loose piece of cartilage. And then there was this kind of like bone on bone exposed surface now, because obviously the cartilage covers the joint. You have this bone on bone now because you removed that 3 by 3 section. So they go in and poke a bunch of holes in it to elicit some blood flow into the joint space. So that helps develop scar tissue in the joint. So basically doing whatever they can to try and salvage it and not have that bone on bone contact. So try and poke some holes, build some scar tissue around that, and then you won't have that. So that was kind of what they did in that surgery. And I had a labral tear as well. And it's called FAI, femoral acetabular impingement. So basically the way my hips align wasn't quite correct. So I had a few moving parts in this operation, but they went and fixed as much as they could. They did this microfracture. And then following that, it was 6 weeks of non-weight bearing. So go through that. That had its own intricacies, but go through the full rehab, kind of fast forward to about 6 months out of that first surgery, and I just didn't get better. Like it was going great until I started to load the joint again, and then right away, like boom, pains back. So at about 6 months, then I decided, like, okay, well, this first surgery didn't work. I'm moving down at this point from Kelowna to Vancouver, so I got referred to a new surgeon. And at that point, I went and saw him, and kind of at that first appointment, I don't mean to ramble, but at that first appointment, then we decided, like, you can either go on the list right now and get that replacement done, or if you can endure the pain for another 10 years, then maybe it makes sense to kind of kick the can down the road, because at this point, like, you have osteoarthritis. We've done everything we can up until this point. If it's just a matter of 3 years, like, you're going to need a revision surgery down the way anyways. Does it make sense to kind of like bite down on the mouth guard for 3 years just to get the replacement then, or just get the replacement? So at that point, I went on the list to actually get it.
And so once you did get it, how did this procedure affect, the other parts of your life at that time?
Yeah, so It was a good procedure, honestly. And I think reflecting back on, so again, I had the hip arthroscopy first, and then I had the total joint replacement about a year and a half later. The total hip replacement was actually a great rehab process. And I commend Canadian healthcare and how far medicine has really taken joint replacement, at least in this situation. I was up on crutches doing stairs the same day. I got discharged from the hospital the same day. I was back to work. Fortunately, I work remotely, so I was able to be back to work kind of within the first week of my rehab. So it was a great process, and I think building off of that, I was able to go see the physiotherapist quite a bit. Tried to really do as many of the exercises in the rehab that I could, because I knew, again, I'm kind of at the end of my leash here. I want to make sure I'm kind of your ideal patient. Let's go through the full rehab routine. So did all the exercises, did as much rehab as possible, and kind of getting towards where I am now. I did have a flare up a couple months ago, but I think it's still just muscle imbalance. So having nursed this for like 6 years, basically it affected my gait, and I walked with a limp quite a bit. So obviously your body adapts to this to try and protect the joint itself. So as I was walking, I developed this huge muscle imbalance. So I had a little bit of pain a couple months ago, and they think it's still just muscle weakness on my affected side. But I've been able to get back to a lot of things that I wasn't able to do before, like a lot of the longer walks, like take my dog on a Saturday morning and go for a 10-kilometer like walk, and even just flat ground. Like previously that would have just like lit me up for the couple days following that before these operations. And then now with it, I don't really have to think about kind of the fallout. And I think that's a big part of, I always equate it to kind of having like a timer for your joint. You can expend so much time, and kind of as you get past that, then you're going to pay for it. And I think that's one of the big things that I'm sure you can relate to, is like not having that anymore. And I think probably your medications help manage that, but I'm able to do things without really thinking of the consequences as much.
Yeah, because I think you also get really used to living now with this chronic condition. So you've learned how to like adapt and how to figure out pain management strategies and the way that you can like live your life as pain-free as possible, which is still a challenge. And I feel like it is for everyone because there will be ups and downs. But I think that over time and over a period of time, you learn how to work with the disease rather than just like, saying now I have this disease, my life is over, because now you're able to really work with it and figure out, okay, this is what I can do today, but I can't do this tomorrow. And sometimes you can just be spontaneous. How are you feeling when you realize that, okay, like I can't do something that I really, really like doing anymore?
It sucks, honestly. I think it's a big mental shock. I think I come from a place where I'm used to not saying no to myself. Like if I put my mind to something, I'm going to do it. And I think being constrained physically while not mentally is a weird thing. And I think that's one thing that took a lot of time to adjust to, of like, if I say I'm going to go run this hill, I'm going to run this hill, whether I can or not, or whether I'm going to pay for it or not. So I think adapting to that, and like basically like injuring myself over and over again to the point where you finally say like, it's just not worth it. Like I could do it, but it's not worth it. I think that was a big undertaking. And being able to have that as a choice, I think, was a big one for me, of like, I'm consciously choosing not to do this, rather than I think a lot of people out there probably like it's not an option. So in before my surgeries, like if I wanted to go run 5K, I could still do that, but I would just pay for it on the other side. But then getting to the point where I could say, okay, it's not worth it, was a big one. And it definitely took a lot of kind of mental gymnastics almost to kind of take, like, I'm a super active guy, I can do what I want, to all of a sudden I'm putting up these boundaries for myself, and I'm not used to doing that. And I'm sure you can attest to these things too, of like you're used to being able to do whatever you want, and then all of a sudden it's constrained by some external force that you don't know really why or how it happened to you, and it's not necessarily your fault, but all of a sudden now you just have to start putting up these strategic walls. And I think that was a weird one to adapt to, not having done that before. But I think, again, being at like a 24, 25-year-old when I started to do this, I was in a fairly good state to make these conscious decisions, versus I think as like a grade 8, when you're quite active, you're playing tennis and stuff. I'd be curious on how that affected you, because I was a totally different person at that age, and I definitely wouldn't be as conscious or of sound mind to make that decision at that age.
You have to consciously make an effort to figure out like what you need and what your needs are in order to succeed. That's really hard to come to like even be motivated to do that. It's hard to be like, hey, like I want to do this, these are my goals, and I'm going to try to do it no matter what. Because there are a lot of people that will bring you down. You need to have your own kind of resilience, and like you need to be able to advocate for yourself, because there's so many people that are going to be like, no, you can't do it. And I'm wondering, like,
Yeah.
on that note, have you had to access any accommodations? Did you ever need that at any point? I know like 24, 25, like you were kind of done undergrad. So
Honestly, I've had a really good run. So I think I haven't really needed any accommodations. I've had a great support system around me, whether it's friends and family, or again, at that point, I was kind of out of my education, at least at that stage. So I didn't really need a lot of accommodations and stuff. It was more of self-imposed stuff. So getting back to what we previously talked about, it was more of like personal adaptation. Got a great support system around me. I've always had great individuals helping me out. It was more just like, honestly, a lot of self-inflicted stuff. So like spend a lot of time in the gym or a lot of time doing active things, I'm going to have to back that off. And that's just the reality of it. But as far as like accommodations and stuff go, the only one that comes to mind is I was working in Fort McMurray, Alberta for a little bit and trying to do stuff like I did quite a bit of work on sand. So I was around tailings ponds. So I was working as a geotechnical engineer there for a couple of years, and working in work boots for like a 12-hour shift on sand just like destroyed my hip. So trying to adjust that, and kind of like, I'm not really one to speak up either. I don't want to be kind of the squeaky wheel in the sense. I would just like put my head down and just deal with it. So my personality is more like introspective in that sense, and I tend to bottle those things up. So in those instances, I probably could have. And like a lot of companies are really good about adaptations these days, and accessibility and different needs. And I think a lot of that is reflected from COVID and kind of the accommodations that needed to be made for that. But yeah, I don't think I really needed a ton. It was just more of an adjustment of like, I'm dealing with this pain now. How can I self-manage to try and kind of optimize my situation, given that pain is going to happen regardless? So
were you going to go to physio school, but you didn't end up going?
I did my bachelor's in engineering, master's in engineering as well. And then I started my PhD and then decided to get into the MPT PhD program. So it's like a joint physio school PhD program. So I was enrolled in that. And then it's a funny story. I was actually supposed to start last September. I was supposed to start physio school. So it would have been 2 years PhD and then started physio school. That goes for 26 months and then goes back to PhD. So it's a super cool program, and I've got a lot of good contacts in there, and it's really interesting for anyone curious about it. Highly recommend it. But I was supposed to start in September of 2022, and funny enough, I had my operation come up in September 2022, right? So at that time, I was scheduled, I was enrolled for physio school. I was like starting, like orientation week's going to be coming up, and then boom, you get a letter in the mail saying your surgery date's come up. It's like 2 weeks into the start of term for physio school. And like, as you know, similar to medical school or any of these things, like these programs are kind of like drinking through a fire hose, and it's not really an option to kind of skip prolonged periods. So it was more or less like kind of an acceptance between the program and myself that maybe it wasn't a good time to start that. So I decided to deferred for a year, and I ended up deciding to just drop out of the program and just continue on with the PhD component, because I think the way my PhD has worked out, I'm relatively far along. So kind of pressing pause in September 2023, so coming September, to go into physio school didn't really make sense for me. I'd rather just get the PhD done and then see, do I want to go into physio school at that point? Do I want to pursue a postdoc? Do I want to go into industry? So I think just finishing the PhD program makes the most sense at this time for me. But yeah, it's funny how things work out, right? Like having supposed to start, and then all of a sudden, boom, like again, just like that diagnosis, things happen. All of a sudden, like your path changes, and you just kind of have to flow with it with kind of as much preparation and kind of luck as you have. Just make an informed decision at the time and kind of do that to your best of your ability.
Yeah, for sure. And we talked a lot about, being physically active and before your diagnosis. And obviously you had your surgery, and at that point you would have to do some sort of exercises or go into like rehab physio, whatever that kind of helps you get back to where you should be. And so I'm wondering, how did you kind of get back into being active?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I think a lot of people can probably attest to that. Of it's a big process, right? Like as much as everyone thinks like, boom, I get surgery, I'm going to go back to my normal everyday activities. Like surgery, a physio described it to me as like surgery is its own trauma for the body, right? So like although you think surgery and surgeries come so far these days, it's still a huge undertaking, and your body takes months and months to recover from that. So I think for a total hip, your average recovery time to like more or less fully healed is about 4 to 6 months, but for full recovery, it's about 12 months. So you're kind of back to doing whatever you want to do at about 4 to 6, depending. And again, this all of this is kind of with asterisks because I'm not the typical age group that gets this procedure done, right? So looking into the evidence and like because I'm a PhD student, I'm quite kind of adept at the research. I was curious on it. So I was going in, I was on Google Scholar looking at all these different articles, and like none of it really applies to me. Like even the rehab programs, I was kind of on YouTube just trying to figure out like what are young adults doing for rehab, because all of these rehab programs that I'm seeing are for like your 65 to 80-year-old like grandma or your mom or something like that. So none of this really applies. So I think that was an interesting finding of what I'm getting to here, is trying to do that rehab, but tailor it in a way that made sense for me. I was coming into surgery as quite active, and I wanted to kind of keep that up and keep that momentum into my rehab. So really just kind of looking into a program that made sense for me. And I think it was still quite involved. So I did probably 3 to 4 months of really strict rehab. Again, I wanted to kind of make sure that I did all the exercises as prescribed, tried to be the ideal patient because again, I'm at the end of my leash. I want to make sure I do this and do it right and kind of put my all into it so I could get back to normal activity. But again, it was just it was a weird situation. And I'm sure you can probably attest to this as well, of like finding things that really fit your demographics and like your goals specifically, like trying to get back. Okay, I want to be in the gym an hour and a half every day. How do I go from I just had my hip replaced to get to that stage of like, can I be squatting anymore? Can I be doing the elliptical and things like that? How can I tailor this rehab program to get me back to that as quickly as possible?
What is your routine of being active now?
Yeah, so I think to preface, I one aspect of my personality and how I self-identify is being active, and I think that's been for the last kind of since undergrad. Undergrad was kind of the messy point, and I think a lot of people can attest to that. Of things fall off, exams come up, like it's not as easy to maintain a consistent schedule. But kind of following undergrad, I always resonated, and I don't have many hobbies, but I think working out and just kind of being a gym rat, for lack of a better term, is part of who I am. So kind of I really anchor part of my personality in being active. So my typical routine is I'll get up in the morning, I'll read a bit, and then I'll go to the gym. Usually it's about an hour and a half, maybe 6 or 7 days a week. I'll do kind of an hour of resistance training and then about a half hour of cardio. And I think it's almost as much for me mental as it is physical, because it just helps and put my headphones on. I'm in a clear space. I don't have anyone emailing me or texting me or anything like that. It's kind of my me time. So I think, yeah, I just try and balance it, and not specifically like, I don't think I can be an athlete, quote unquote, anymore. So like I was a marathoner before, a triathlete. Like I don't really resonate with any specific sport. It's more or less just trying to be as active as possible and maintain kind of a healthy body as much as possible these days. And I'd be curious on what your kind of routine and your thoughts on exercise as someone with a chronic condition are, because I think it varies so much, and let alone when you layer on top the concept of being younger with one of these conditions.
Oh my God, I literally don't have any sort of routine. It's not that good. Like, I feel like I am not the prime example of active. I am definitely not. And I was never an
But
active.
you're in the weeds of undergrad still. Like
Yeah, that's true. I guess, see, but that also becomes an excuse, you know? Like, I'll be like, oh, I'm always going to be in school, so it's always going to be an excuse. And I think that's like the worst thing. But I was never an active person before I was diagnosed. So I don't find myself like wanting to be extra active now either, because like that just wasn't me. I'm more of like an artistic person. Like I sang, I dance.
to reflect back on kind of between both of us, I think the underlying theme here is just do what works for you, honestly. And I think as people with these chronic conditions, we know that exercise in some capacity helps as tolerated. Like obviously you don't want to go way into the deep end and overdo it, but it's good to be active in some capacity. So I think just finding what works for you. And if that's again more on my side where it's like part of my routine, it's kind of if I don't do it, I get super stressed, versus you have to schedule it in or do it with these groups, like whatever works for you, honestly. If you can maintain an active lifestyle, and I think building off of that, if that helps you manage your condition, then just do whatever exercise means to you. And whether that's walking or resistance training or group dance or something like that. Like however you can be active and build it into your schedule within reason, I think is super important. And again, you won't really stick to something, or at least in my experience, you won't stick with it unless you like doing it. So honestly, just find what makes you happy in an active capacity, whether that's hiking or bike riding or walking your dog or whatever it is, and try and stick with that. You only get one body, and although we have these chronic conditions, you can still tweak all these different variables as much as possible to kind of fine tune your own sense of self. So I think whatever that means to you, I think is useful to do in some capacity. So I think certain, like trying different nutrition, different sleep schedules, different activity schedules, like modifying all these factors that you can control or within your means, I think is super important. And that's one thing that has helped me manage this condition, is just trying to like, does this diet make a difference? Does this sleep pattern make a difference? Running gives me a huge flare up. Well, let's back off on that a little bit. And it takes time. Like it's not an overnight solution to kind of try these different things out, but whatever is kind of under your control, I think is great to play with.
And also like the types of shoes that I wear when I am active, or I used to be a very stressed person. Like I used to stress out about my brother. I used to stress out like just like my little brother who used to like lose his water bottle and like not get on the bus. And like it was just like I was a very stressed out kid. And so I've learned to stress out, like I'm not as stressed anymore. Or like I kind of am like, it's not worth it. And so like changing your mindset also helps in terms of, pain management strategies, or like figuring out like as a lifestyle, like you're implementing more of a positive mindset, less stress. Obviously, there's going to be negative thoughts. Originally, when I was diagnosed, I was like, why me? I used to cry all the time. But like I've changed in a way, kind of evolved, I would say, to a point where I now know that like, okay, this is going to be something that I'm going to have to live with. So how am I going to like ensure that I can still like live my life and still be a positive person and like still do what I want to do in less stress and pain as possible?
Yeah. Can I ask you something, Natasha?
Yeah.
So if you think back, given where you are now, and you've come this huge distance from where you are originally, if you were to say something to yourself kind of at your time of diagnosis, talk to young Natasha, what's your 30-second pitch to her? What are you going to say that like it's going to be okay, or what advice are you going to give, or just what's at top of mind for that?
I would definitely say that it gets better. When I was 13, I was freaking out that it's not going to get better. I was just so stressed. I'm in so much pain, swelling. I'm on these medications, but honestly, it gets so much better. You find people that you can talk to through research or organizations and so many other things. Like I've just learned how to live with it, but also adapt with it. And I know we've mentioned that a lot. And I think I definitely say to like my younger self that it gets better, and there are people that are there to support you throughout your journey. You just have to be patient about it, because I think if you want everything right now, it's not going to work. The medication, it's not going to be there right when you get your diagnosis. It's a journey. And I don't think a lot of us know that when we're diagnosed. One more thing that I'd say is a lot of patients tend to Google side effects of medications, and their families also do that too. And we feel like we don't want to get on medications. Know that your doctors are there for you. They're making good decisions for you, because we're so vulnerable